In the first three Mishnayot from Mishnah Megillah 3, several rabbis consider the permanent state of a synagogue's holiness, ultimately holding that whether a Jewish community is actively using a synagogue or not, the building always retains a sacred character and must be treated in light of that. While the Mishnah concludes that the synagogue has a forever holy character, the Mishnaic rabbis fail to answer a crucial question. Why does the synagogue remain a perpetually hallowed place? We know the rabbinic conclusion, but how can we reconstruct the reasoning that accounts for the synagogue's residual holiness? As I hope to show in this presentation, Mishnah Megillah 3:1's chiastic structure provides an answer. The location of the Torah scroll, a physical object at the center of the town, bestows an enduring holy character upon the synagogue. The Torah scroll is the defining object of rabbinic towns. In the second half of this presentation, I will turn to the Roman world to show that Roman neighborhoods also featured centrally located objects, statues to deities or human heroes, and these were somewhat akin to the role of the Torah scroll in the rabbinic world. The key difference, however, between the rabbinic and Roman central objects concerns their opposing force. The force generated by the object in the rabbinic world is centripetal. The Torah scroll draws objects or spaces to itself to be sanctified. On the other hand, the force of the Roman world central object is centrifugal. The Roman statue encourages movement away from the center of the neighborhood and toward the boundaries of the empire. This comparison is part of my broader study that works toward a more sophisticated model of cultural interpenetration between the rabbis and Romans. On the one hand, the rabbis lived under Roman rule and were embedded within Greco-Roman culture, evidenced by the work that scholars like Chaim Lapin have done in showing that the rabbis accepted and even regulated in their own texts parts of Roman culture, like the bathhouse. On the other hand, we can talk about rabbinic culture because the rabbis did separate themselves from the Romans. While we certainly cannot collapse rabbinic culture into Roman culture, we can nevertheless see that rabbinic culture was touched by its Greco-Roman surroundings. In this paper, I will limit my rabbinic Roman comparison to the navigation of city space. We know that bodies moving throughout space is a common cultural issue and thus perfect to build a comparison around. By noting how the Romans defined spatial boundaries, we can then learn more about how the rabbis related to, borrowed from, and even rejected elements of their Roman landscape. With that contextualization of my larger project, let us now turn to the first question of this paper. Why is the synagogue a forever holy place, and what power does the central object of the Torah have in giving the synagogue that character? We will begin with a reading and analysis of the primary text of Mishnah Megillah 3:1, paying special attention to the chiastic structure and centrality of the Torah. It is the object toward which all other spaces and objects are directed and on which they turn. You can follow along with this reading on the first page of your handout. Townspeople who sold the town's open space may purchase a synagogue with the proceeds. If they sold a synagogue, they may purchase an ark. An ark, they may purchase Torah scroll coverings. Torah scroll coverings, they may purchase biblical books. Biblical books, they may purchase a Torah scroll. But if they sold a Torah scroll, they may not purchase biblical books. Biblical books, they may not purchase Torah scroll coverings. Torah scroll coverings, they may not purchase an ark. An ark, they may not purchase a synagogue. A synagogue, they may not purchase an open space. To summarize this Mishnah, it mandates specific uses for money earned from the sale of holy spaces and objects, from open space in a town to a Torah scroll. Specifically, it says that one must always use money from the sale of a holy space or object for a more holy purpose. For instance, one can take money from the sale of a synagogue and purchase an ark, a more holy object than a synagogue, but one cannot work backwards from the sale of a synagogue and take that money to purchase a less holy thing, like the town's open space. As evidenced by the constraints placed on the use of the funds associated with every object in this list, and also the direction in which the funds can be used, more holy to less holy purchases, the rabbis conclude that some objects are more holy than others. And so this Mishnah exemplifies what I call a hierarchy of holiness. At the top of the hierarchy, that is the most holy object, we have the Torah scroll. And this Mishnah creates a chiasmus where all the elements in the list fold in on themselves. I've illustrated that chiasmus on the second page of the handout. On the way down the list, we go from objects of lesser holiness, a town's open space, to greater holiness, ultimately a Torah scroll. But the second half of the list reverses that, hence the chiastic structure. We move from objects of greater holiness, a Torah scroll, to lesser holiness, a town's open space. With this preliminary textual work now complete, we can return to my original question. What imbues the synagogue, in the eyes of the rabbis, with its perpetually holy character? To answer this question, we must realize how central the Torah scroll is for this Mishnah's list. Note that all other spaces and objects here are folding in on the Torah scroll. Their interaction with the Torah scroll apparently gives these objects their own holiness. To borrow a term from the field of physics, the Torah scroll exhibits a centripetal force. It pulls everything in this Mishnah's list toward itself. We can best imagine this relationship between the most holy Torah scroll and the other objects and spaces in the list from the Mishnah by using a visual rendering of concentric circles on the second page of the handout. The Torah is the central ring, and the other objects and spaces are contained in circles around the central one. While each circle grows larger and thus moves away from the Torah center, by nature of the concentric circle relationship, each space or object represented by one of the circles does share the same center of the Torah, even though the circles are at different radii from that central Torah point. This means that the Torah scroll's force touches every space and object and affects everything. Crucial for our inquiry about the perpetually sacred nature of the synagogue is one of the concentric circles around the Torah scroll's central point. The synagogue shares that Torah scroll center. The Mishnah thus indicates that the synagogue is forever sanctified because of its relationship to the Torah. The Torah's force is so powerful to draw everything to itself, even in a way that the rabbis cannot put words to, but they can try to represent in literary style with that chiasmus. An object or space that shares the Torah's center, which includes the synagogue, cannot escape the pull of the Torah's centripetal, that is, pulling to the center, force. In a section of Seth Schwartz's book, Imperialism and Jewish Society, where he performs a reading of this very Mishnah, Schwartz nicely summarizes my own position regarding the Torah scroll's effect on the synagogue. He says, quote, "The synagogue's sanctity was derived entirely from the Torah scroll," end quote. And continuing, he then makes explicit that the synagogue's forever holy character results from, quote, "proximity, physical or conceptual, to the Torah scroll," end quote. Simply put, the Torah scroll permanently transfers holiness to the synagogue. We know this also because of the two Mishnayot that follow the first Mishnah's chiasmus. In Mishnah Megillah 3:2 and 3:3, which you can see on the first page of the handout, the rabbis limit the purposes for which a sold, destroyed, or otherwise inactive synagogue may be used, as well as the activities that may happen inside its boundaries. For example, using the building as a bathhouse or as a privy is not allowed, and treating the synagogue as a place for mundane activities, like using it as a shortcut, is also impermissible. In this way, the synagogue is always set apart from a normal building where ordinary activities can take place. The rabbis would not need to place these limitations on the use of a synagogue building, if not for the synagogue's forever holy character, thanks to its proximity to the Torah scroll. Even when the Torah scroll is not mentioned in 3:2 and 3:3, the rulings regarding the treatment of the synagogue for all time are only possible because of the Torah scroll. It is the unsung hero of these Mishnayot. In the latter half of my presentation, I'd like to consider the Roman world and their conception of centrally located objects, somewhat similar to the role of the Torah scroll as conceived of in the Mishnah. I hope that by drawing on the Roman response to defining space, we will better be able to see this issue as a common cultural concern that also necessitates the rabbinic response in the Mishnah. Each group is working out what it means to be emplaced in a town and tries to emphasize their values in the process. Just as the rabbis imagine the Torah scroll as the central object of their towns, with the Torah scroll sanctifying objects and spaces in relation to it, so too the Romans had central objects in their towns, sacred shrines or statues. But the key difference is that these Roman objects had a centrifugal force, that is, movement away from the center. The statue sent people out from that middle point in the neighborhood where the statue was located and toward the bounds of the empire, fulfilling the Roman imperative of imperial expansion. We'll get back to this point in a moment. First, to contextualize this discussion, the ancient Romans believed that many lares, spirits or gods, guarded their cities. Ovid attests the multiplicity of these lares, writing in Fasti, quote, "The city, being Rome, has 1,000 lares," end quote. Significant for our study, the Romans erected shrines to these deities, which were most often found in an area of the city known as the Compitum. Using a definition from ancient Roman historian Bert Lott, the Compitum is, quote, "literally a crossroads where streets met, but in its urban form, a street altar or shrine for the neighborhood's lares," end quote. In other words, people could find shrines to lares at these centrally located crossroads in the neighborhoods, at these compita. Additionally, I'll note that from my study of ancient Roman texts, some of the shrines at these compita were not dedicated to the gods, but rather to mortal heroes, a point of which we'll see its significance soon. Returning now to consider the shrine's centrifugal force, I use this concept borrowed from physics to talk about these Roman shrines because the shrines inspired an imperial outlook that sent people away from the center of the neighborhood where the shrine sat. Shrines to Lares, the guardian spirits, were tangible reminders that the Lares would protect the Roman people, and thus they should not fear taking up arms on behalf of the Roman Empire and its expansionist project. With regard to the statues of heroes in neighborhoods, these statues emphasize that some Roman ancestors chose to leave the safety of their neighborhood and participate in Roman territorial expansion, an imperial goal. Regardless of whether these heroic Romans lived or died, they were honored with a statue that immortalized them. In either case, I believe that these Roman statues were meant to send a particular message to the ancient Romans who saw them inside the safe boundaries of the neighborhood at the compita, the crossroads. To those who would fight on behalf of the empire, there were two positive outcomes. Either the Lares, the guardian spirits, would protect those Romans from harm, or they would be forever memorialized for their heroism in the form of centrally located statues. To summarize this rabbinic Roman comparison, both the rabbis and the Romans agree that centrally located objects, whether they be the Torah scroll or statues to deities, have an effect on the entire town. The Torah scroll sits at the center of concentric circles, sanctifying objects and spaces that share its center, despite the objects and spaces being at different radii from that central point of the Torah scroll. The Torah scroll exhibits a centripetal force, pulling components of the rabbinic town, like the synagogue, toward itself to touch them with its holiness. Likewise, a Roman statue is also at the center of concentric circles, with the rings surrounding the statue being neighborhood, city, and empire. But in contrast to the rabbis, the Roman statues existed to direct people to flee the center. This is the concept of the statue's centrifugal force at play. Instead, people were to seek the ever-expanding edge of the empire. At first glance, the rabbis and Romans seem quite similar with regard to their placement of a central object, whether it be the Torah scroll or a statue to a deity or human hero. But upon further examination, we see that these central objects serve opposing purposes. First, from the Mishnah, we learn that the Torah scroll draws objects and spaces toward itself so that they can receive some of its holiness and be forever changed because of that contact. And thanks to the synagogue's proximity to the Torah scroll, the rabbis in the Mishnah reason that the synagogue is a forever holy space, again, because of its relation to that central sanctifying object of the Torah scroll. Yet from our brief study of Roman texts and material culture, we see that the central statue in Roman neighborhoods does not function like the central Torah scroll, for it sends people away from the safety of the neighborhood and toward the outermost circle of the empire. We thus learn that the rabbis and Romans maneuvered the same town space, but they embedded themselves in the space differently. The Romans utilized city space to turn outward toward the expanding empire, and thanks to this arrangement of space, an ancient Roman was constantly reminded of Rome's imperial outlook and his own role in territorial expansion. But the rabbis of the Mishnah arranged their town space to turn inward toward the Jewish center and the Torah scroll. In this way, they break with the surrounding Roman culture when it comes to negotiating space. We see the rabbis clarify that while they are living within the Roman world, and borrowing pieces from that culture, they also are members of a distinct rabbinic culture that approaches the shared tension of maneuvering space in a completely opposite way. So, with that, our rabbinic Roman comparison and some preliminary conclusions now out of the way, our tale of two centers has come to a close.